And again, I'll welcome you. So rather than kind of give my bio that can be read online, I want to introduce myself with two different stories. First will be the story of how I experienced deep flow while creating this curriculum called mFLOW. The second story will be about the utter loss of flow last Thursday when I had to cancel and reschedule this last minute. And it will really hopefully highlight how mindfulness, or the way we practice mindfulness, is very context dependent. Right? Flow is an experience that is based on conditions, right? And when the conditions change, the way that we experience the moment changes. And so it turns out that pandemic and quarantine for me were highly conducive flow conditions, surprisingly. And I wrote a blog about it and sent it out, I think, 2 weeks ago. And it suggested that the conditions that Csikszentmihalyi, the flow researcher, he had identified that novelty, complexity, unpredictability, and risk are all environmental conditions that are conducive to the flow state, and they were all there. Novelty, we had never experienced this before. Unpredictability, no idea what's going to happen next, right? Complexity, it was impacting everything. And risk, even going to the grocery store felt like it could be a life or death experience. And so with all of this, it brought me into the present moment. I wasn't able to go back to my old way of being or my old normal, and the future was unknowable. And so I found myself on this razor's edge of the present moment, no place to go. And of course, there were moments that needed to be managed, right? Getting a little bit too caught up in the media and the what if, and we're trying to sell our house at the same time. But my mindfulness practice was deep enough that I could ride these waves right back into the flow state again and again. So there were other flow conditions that also contributed. I work for myself, so does my wife. So there's a high degree of motivation to create and innovate something new. Another flow trigger was the topic itself. Flow is something that's extremely interesting to me. It's something that I know a bit about, so there's a high level of competence, but it's still something I've been wanting to go deeper into. Right? This would be the course that I would want to participate in. So this high level of interest and engagement was also a flow trigger. Another flow trigger was finally some space to create. I had plans for throughout the entire year to be doing what I call the MPeak Roadshow, where I travel around. I've been teaching the 3-day MPeak intensive, mostly to Department of Homeland Security and Navy Special Warfare. I was packed with my schedule. Danilo, who I see on the call here, he and I were supposed to be teaching a course. Right now, I would be flying to Rio de Janeiro and teaching MPeak there. So everything was just highly scheduled and very predictable. And then all of a sudden, completely blank, which actually was amazing. It gave me the freedom to fully immerse myself in the flow practices. I started doing non-dual mindfulness meditation. I started practicing Qigong. I started doing mindful journaling. I started doing mindful walking and other practices that I'll introduce later as part of the mFLOW curriculum. And so as I was able to take the space to fully immerse myself in these practices, I was starting to get insights on the course itself. It's as if the practices themselves wrote the curriculum. I would be deep into a practice and I would have some kind of a breakthrough or an insight. It would be like, that's how I'm going to teach that module. Or, oh, that's where that fits. So really the practice for me was just getting out of my own way, trusting emergence, staying open, and in a way just allowing the curriculum to write itself. It almost felt like the curriculum was being birthed rather than built, or like I was playing Tetris, where a different module would start to drop from the ether or wherever insight comes from. And I would just need to twist it, rotate it, and then clunk, there it is, session 2. And then it'd fall down, clunk, there's the practice for session 3. And it felt like it was just this flowing activity of building. Sometimes it felt like I was carving a sculpture where I would create way too much content. There would be a ton of information. I would just start to chisel away, trying to come up with the core essential teachings in any one bit, right? So it was this deep flow creative experience that ultimately gave me a sense of purpose that lasted through the pandemic for the most part until conditions changed, which they very much did last week. And when the conditions changed, it required a different kind of mindfulness practice. So let me paint a picture of the conditions. So there's the backdrop now of protests and race riots. And I work with a lot of law enforcement, and I had just gone to a protest and was just feeling a lot of compassion for everyone on all sides. And I was feeling a little bit of sadness as well. And then I think this was Monday. And then Tuesday, I had a medical procedure I had been postponing. And so I finally had that scheduled and woke up with an anesthesia hangover. And then the next day, we had a family emergency that ended in an intervention that had been building for about 3 years. So then I have this emotional hangover. And so I come to the intended intro last Thursday, already feeling a little bit raw and not so in my flow. Now, if it were any one of these conditions, or even the conditions I just presented, I probably had enough mindfulness to work with it. But then about 5 minutes or 10 minutes before the session, my phone starts to blow up, my inbox starts to ding, and I get about 60 emails and phone calls from people who are saying the link is not working. And so in this moment, I feel my heart rate start to increase. My palms start to sweat. My mind starts to race up. Oh no, what should I do? I'm going to let these people down. They're all going to show up. I should just send a new link. No, I don't even know what the link is now. I hired someone for the first time to help me with my admin, so I don't even know what went wrong. I should have done it myself. I should have known better. Blah, blah, blah. And I can feel this. And for those of you who've taken the MP course, and there's quite a few of you here, it was a straw breathing moment. This is an exercise where we breathe through a coffee stirring straw, and we just feel what it's like to have this anxiety provoking physical sensation, but to ride the waves. And so I paused and I found my breath and I felt my heart and I checked in, I observed the thoughts. And now, according to mindfulness, it doesn't really matter where I go, whether I move forward and figure out how to keep the course going, or whether I reschedule it, not the point. The point of mindfulness is to check in so that you have a level of discernment around what's true for you in any moment. And for me, it felt like, well, I feel like if I send out a link 2 minutes after the hour, people are going to be trickling in. They're not going to get the intro. I don't think these are conducive conditions. And given all the variables, including my own internal variables and my own ability to show up, it seemed like the best choice of action was to let it go and to reschedule. So thank you all for your openness to rescheduling. Happy to have almost 50 of you here with me today who are interested in the topic of flow. And ultimately, I think it was meant to happen this way. I got a pretty decent intro story out of the whole thing, so maybe worthwhile. So I'm going to now transition into a screen share, and we'll begin to dive in a little bit deeper here. So I will assume that everyone can see this. So the story I just told highlights the difference between 2 different programs that I've created and will be offering mFLOW next. So mFLOW is for performance enhancement. It's taking what's already good and making it great. Where mFLEX is the use of mindfulness in dealing with difficulty, right? Really bringing a sense of presence to challenging moments and situations. You can say that mFLOW is learning how to shred better on a wave, and mFLEX is learning how to paddle out in big whitewash, and then how to get back on your board after you've crashed. on a wave, right? And this is going to be, again, dependent on the conditions. So when the conditions are right, meaning the challenge you're up against is equally proportionate to or just a little bit higher than your skill or ability, then there's a certain way that we practice mindfulness. It's about trusting emergence, right? Trusting the training you already have, getting out of your own way. Right? This is a sense of just openness to experience. There's an effortlessness in the way we bring mindfulness to the moment in these conditions. But when the challenge we're experiencing is far greater than our capacity, or when it's far lower than our capacity, then we need to practice noticing thoughts and emotions without judgment, riding the waves of these emotions, pausing and reflecting on the thoughts we have, and then choosing a more skillful and mindful response in the moment of stress or chaos. Another key feature to mFLOW is this experience of loss of sense of self, right? In the flow conditions, they say we're just all one. And there's a way that we can let go or perform without being a performer, right? This emergence with the present moment versus self-compassion, which is treating yourself the way you would treat a friend, treating yourself with kindness. Just to get it out of the way, I'll make sure we all have the definition of flow. Flow is a state of total immersion with the present moment, accompanied by a feeling of energized focus, enjoyment in the process or the activity of whatever you're doing, right? There's this sense of full focus and presence in whatever you're doing that often is accompanied again by this loss of sense of self and a dilation of time. So why? Why do we care? Why would we want to practice uh, increasing our ability to get into this state of flow? Well, performance enhancement is one obvious reason. Records are set, personal bests are broken, the impossible is achieved when in the state of flow. It's the state of flow that has people really be able to access their greatest gifts and create their greatest results. But there's also an element of attractiveness that's not brought up quite as often. I've always found it curious that people will pay so much money to go to a sports game or to go to a live music concert or live stand-up comedy when they could just as easily watch it on television, usually with a better picture, or they could listen to it for free on Spotify. But there's something attractive about seeing someone else in flow, right? Being talented, giving their gifts. It's almost like flow is contagious, or it can be given to you by transmission. So when we go to see others in flow, it pulls us into this group flow experience that is highly desirable. I was actually fascinated with my own willingness to spend hours listening to a podcast. But when the host and the guest know their topic deeply and know how to just be themselves and feel natural in the flow of conversation, it's attractive. I don't want to stop listening. I'm fully engaged. They have brought me into their flow. And we see this time and time again, like salespeople that could sell a tank off a car lot, right? Leaders who can get anyone to follow them. Um, there's example after example of how even politicians, right, can use some sense of charisma. They trust themselves, whether they're trustworthy or not. We'll also get into the shadow of flow in session 1 to get people on board with their belief systems. So there's a sense of effectiveness and attractiveness, but also an increased sense of well-being. So we'd like to say that flow is a means to an end, right? You will get a better result, you will perform better, but it's also an end in itself. Flow is good for its own sake. The experience of flow is joy-inducing. This is a good thing. I'd actually argue that flow feels so good that even if it was a little bit bad for your performance, it might still be worthwhile, right? I might still do it every once in a while just because it feels good. So I want to take us into an experience now where you'll have an opportunity to tune into a memory of your own flow experience. And then we'll discuss this afterward. So obviously, if you're driving or if you're not in a position to do this, you can just sit it out. Otherwise, I'll ask that everyone again position yourself and set yourself up for a short practice. And so that might look like closing your eyes. This will be a little bit of visualization. Turning your attention inward, finding stillness in the body, letting go of all the thoughts about flow for now, letting go of everything I've just said, and coming into the experience of the body breathing. Now, I'm actually going to ask that you use the capacity of intentional thinking to recall a moment where you felt flow in your life. I don't want you to try hard to recall this memory. Rather, just ask yourself the question, when's the last time I felt what I would call a flow experience? You might notice that several different things come up. Just choose one, maybe the one that's most easily accessible. And if you don't have one of those big whopper extreme sports examples, don't worry about it. Maybe think of a time you were just in a conversational flow with someone, or felt flow while gardening, or doing something ordinary but interesting to you. And when you have it, replay the experience. Let yourself kind of savor this memory. Let go of any expectations of how well you're supposed to do this. Just whatever's coming up is fine. How did it feel while you were in this experience? What was your internal kind of state like? Was there an emotion present? What was the quality of mind? The kinds of thoughts, the frequency of thought thinking, if at all? And what were the conditions like externally? What set you up for this experience? What different variables may have played into you achieving flow state in that moment? And finally, how do you feel now as you're reflecting on this memory? Check in with your own body right now, your own emotional state. And then drop the thinking about the flow, drop the memory itself, and see if you can just keep this felt sense in the body for a few more breaths. Feeling ease, and whatever else is there. Let's conclude with a deeper than normal in-breath and an out-breath. And opening the eyes. Good. So we're going to go now into breakout rooms. Part of the mFLOW class is connecting with your fellow participants. Right? This is not going to be a lecture or presentation kind of a course. I will give short presentations to add just enough context so that the exercise and practices make sense. But what this really is an opportunity to practice together and to support each other. Right? When we go into breakout rooms, so all I'm going to do is press a button, and in a moment you'll find yourself in a room with one other person. Uh, I know still to this day when I take a course and the facilitator says, turn to the person next to you and share. There's some part of me that's kind of like, I don't know, I'm good just to be the voyeur. I just want to sit back. I want to just kind of track along, but I don't know if I really want to play. Right? So there's this immediate resistance that I can feel. And it's just that fear of vulnerability. It's the fear of meeting someone new. Maybe I'll be judged. Maybe it'll be weird. But once I let that go, which I'm going to ask that you do too, it's sometimes the deepest experience of the entire course, right? The connection that I have with someone else. And so this is an opportunity for you to just let yourself be vulnerable, to flow being yourself, to let conversation flow, but in a particular way, right? So I'll give you things to focus on, which are these questions. What were the external conditions in your flow experience? What was your mind like, or your body or emotion like? So what was it like internally and externally for you that brought about the experience? And then if you have time, how did it impact your own sense of well-being and your own performance results? Right? So avoid going into the whole story, right? When you've had a really big flow experience, it can be tempting to want to recreate the moment for the other person and really get into it. I'm not going to give enough time for that. We'll take about 5-7 minutes, probably about 7 minutes. So really stay focused on the highlights as you reflect on what created the flow conditions for you. I'd also say that this in itself is a mindfulness practice with someone else. You're practicing being curious. You're practicing listening. You're practicing also what I call common humanity, like really listening to another and engaging with another um, while looking for the me too, looking for how you are similar rather than different with this other person. Excellent. Welcome back. So I hope that you had a wonderful conversation. I know it probably felt maybe a little short for some, maybe even a little long for others, but hopefully what you were able to do was share a little bit about the internal and external conditions that lead to flow for you. So I want to take just a minute or two to hear from maybe one or two of you. Is someone willing to share a bit about your internal experience of flow? You can just take yourself off of mute and share some of the qualities, maybe even some of the qualities that you and your partner had in common with your flow experience.
It's Joe. Um, so we both, Catherine and I, shared a lack of discursive thinking. So there was just in the words that you like to use, trusting emergence. In my particular situation, it was about 20 minutes, and for the first 15 minutes, I can recall zero thoughts. So there was just this sort of blank space in which training practice just came forth without the need to exert any kind of real effort.
Beautiful. So a mindless, kind of selfless, full immersion experience. Anyone else have something to share about the quality? Yes, Ellen.
um, Similar, a sense of acute focus on what is going on around me in the moment. My flow had to do with improv, but who is saying what, retaining that, and being so therefore totally out of my own head.
Yes. So right in the moment, you can't plan for improv. You don't really know what's about to come into that moment. So you have to be ready for anything on that razor's edge of presence. Thank you. How about some other external conditions that may have led to flow? I know that taking yourself off of mute in a big group and speaking might not be flow conditions
So
for
I'll
all of
go.
you. Okay, thank you.
So I kind of, me and Delilah had a nice chat. I mentioned to her about my flow experience happened yesterday. I was out running in the trails, doing some trail running. And as any of you have maybe done some trails, there's plenty of risk involved. There's there's roots in the ground. There's bikers coming from the other way. So there's that condition of the risk was involved. My challenge kind of met the skill level as well. So I've kind of been doing this for a little bit, and I've been doing these trails itself for a while. So the challenge skill balance was there as well. I had a very clear objective as well. So I was going from point A to point B and trying to beat a certain time. So that objective and goal was there. And the trails itself kind of gave me some feedback. So all those external kind of things were kind of met. So those conditions were there.
Thank you. You named a lot of them. So I'm going to pull up the slides again and go over some of these internal and external flow conditions. So it's already been mentioned several times, this challenge to skill ratio. Remember, if the challenge is too high to your skill, then you go into overwhelm and anxiety. If it's too low, boredom and apathy. But when that challenge is right, perfect with the skill, then that pulls us or invites us into flow. Typically, these are activities that are intrinsically rewarding, meaning you enjoy them. You're doing them for their own sake. A sense of autonomy, right? There's a freedom to make your own decisions, to create, to control the experience, right? There's not a lot of flow available on an assembly line. Some degree of novelty and unpredictability, right? The sense of newness or freshness, like anything could happen, right? And so things that are highly habituated and we might consider boring or automatic, it can make it a little more difficult. And some degree of complexity and risk, whether that be a social risk like public speaking, you could look bad or you could crash, or right, there's some risk involved that keeps you sharp. The internal conditions are this focused, present and embodied, right? This is the core of mindfulness practice. There's also a sense of joyfulness, right? This positive attitude, an openness to trusting emergence, right? We get out of our own way so that we can access creativity and insight from beyond the intellect. There's a sense of courage to meet the risk, right? A willingness to face your fear, and a sense of competence and confidence that you can indeed do it. And finally, this selflessness that Joe mentioned, an absence of thought or an ego that's actually doing the performing. So we have this full emergence with or immersion into the performance itself. In session 1 of mFLOW, we'll be going into a little bit more about the difference between effortful and effortless mindfulness, these two different types of practice, which will be new for a lot of you to experience what I'll call effortless mindfulness. We'll also go into the shadows of flow, like how flow can actually take us out of balance or the seeking of it. Then in session 2, we'll go into external conditions. We'll actually do practices to set ourselves up for more flow in our life. In session 3, we'll go into the intrinsic or internal conditions, right? How we can actually cultivate these capacities and attitudes that are conducive to flow. So this is a very common type of testimonial you can get online when you Google flow. There's a lot of these type of quotes. I would visualize the jolt of pain entering my body through the soles of my feet with energy coming from the core of the earth. My feet became a conduit that allowed my body to tap into an infinite energy source that propelled me forward like I was plugged into a nuclear reactor, right? Like infinite energy source, nuclear reactor. You can hear from the drama of the language that this is a pretty deep and rich experience. I want to say right off the bat that this is a classic deep superfluid flow experience, and it's not really the point of mFLOW. right? You would have to already be a fairly elite level performer in putting yourself in some pretty risky situations on a regular basis to cultivate the conditions for this kind of flow. It's going to require a very high competence and a pretty high risk to have this. Now, I hope you have it, and some of you might, but you can't force this to happen. So there's another kind of flow experience that we can condition for a little bit more, right? Empty your mind, be shapeless, formless like water. When you pour water in a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. When you pour water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can drip and it can crash. Be like water, my friend, right? And so here's Bruce Lee, who we've all seen throw just devastating punches and kicks, but who's saying he's being like water, not hard, not rigid, like water. There's a story about a Zen master who, on his deathbed, his students asked him to summarize enlightenment in one sentence. He says it's always having the appropriate response. Right? So there's a way that we can practice flow as a way of being, going with the flow of life, asking ourselves, what wants to happen, or what does this moment need? Right? Being our authentic self. Again, this language I keep using, I'm trusting emergence, going with the flow of life. This can be practiced in all moments, not just in risky, complex moments. And ultimately, that's what we'll be doing in mFLOW. We can experience flow as a state, but that's either going to happen or it's not, right? But we can practice flow as a way of being that we can actually access with greater and greater frequency and ease. A lot of the high performers I work with, when they come to me, they have some idea that I'm just going to teach them how to do a 5-minute meditation before their event, and that's going to be enough, right? Or they're going to have some pre-event routine that's going to condition them for flow. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Right? You cannot be a dumpster fire in your life and expect that you're going to show up on the court or on the stage and that you're going to thrive. Right? We need to flow in all moments, and that conditions ourselves so that we have flow as a way of being. So it's naturally and spontaneously there for us when we need it the most. A 5-minute meditation before an event could be helpful, but if that's the only time you practice, not gonna do it. So we're going to be identifying micro flow opportunities. These are things that have low risk and low complexity, but high enjoyment, right? And still some proportionate skill to challenge ratio, right? And so we can all give examples of these kind of experiences. My latest one has been taking a bike ride with my 1-year-old dog. She's a hound dog. She's chaos on 4 legs. She's a little wild and unpredictable. And I like to ride her on my bike down the street on a leash. And so I trust her enough and can get into flow with her enough that I can maneuver around so that she's safe. I know how to ride a bike pretty well, right? My skill to challenge ratio, though, with the dog makes it a flow activity. It wouldn't be considered a traditional flow activity, but for me, I ritualize it. Every day when I do this dog bike ride, I actually bow in as if I'm going into a performance event, and I bring full presence to it. Right? But I can also get this when presenting or when working with a new coaching client, or right, you can get this during house projects. And so we'll all be identifying these opportunities to practice flow. Whether you're competing or not, doesn't matter, right? We all have these opportunities when we really pay attention. So how does mindfulness relate to the flow experience? If it's not already obvious, I'll make it obvious. I like the quote that says, flow is an accident, mindfulness makes you accident prone. I got this from another quote that says, enlightenment is an accident, meditation makes you accident prone. Right? So mindfulness is a primer for flow. Mindfulness is not the state of flow itself, right? Flow is a little bit more immersive than mindfulness. I think of mindfulness as being like the rocket boosters. They get you into the atmosphere and then they falls away, and flow kind of takes care of itself. And here's how it happens. right? Mindfulness, we know, can help you manage distraction, and so that you can focus attention on the task at hand, or you can bring an open awareness to the entire experience. So we know that flow is about a deep immersion into the present moment in a focused attention. Bingo. This is mindfulness. It brings us right to that state. Noticing and letting go of critical thoughts and stories, and accepting and regulating difficult emotions. In the research, these are the two things named as the number 1 and 2 primary mechanisms of action for why mindfulness helps to induce flow states. Right? Regulation of attention and emotion. Basically, this is the ability to get out of your own way. Right? You've heard this before, right? That most of the Olympic athletes that I work with have already performed a personal best that could be medal winning. But it now comes down to them accessing that talent under pressure. Right? And so when we can notice the pressures, notice the thoughts that may create performance anxiety, notice the emotions of performance anxiety, and to let go of that, now we're actually conditioning ourselves for greater flow. Non-attachment to expectations and outcomes. We actually know that higher attachment to a desired outcome is actually correlated with greater performance anxiety. The worse you want it, the less likely you are to have it, right? So there's a way that we can paradoxically practice this commitment to excellence from moment to moment, trusting that the outcome will take care of itself, but that the outcome is a future moment that we can't control, right? And worrying about it and visualizing it only works to a certain extent. Ultimately, we can detach from that so that we can pay full attention to the opportunities that arise now. Right? Cultivating positive emotions such as joy, optimism, and playfulness. So we know that flow corresponds to this emotion of joy. We also know that mindfulness can help us take in the good or savor moments, right? And that we can cultivate this capacity for positivity. So I see this in a way as being this reverse engineering of the flow state by bringing in the joy that can prime us for flow. Approaching the moment with a beginner's mind, right? So again, a flow trigger is novelty. But when we're really present, we'll see that every moment is novel. No two moments, no two breaths are ever exactly the same. So when we can be specifically present from moment to moment, we can start bringing flow into even ordinary activities. And then finally, we let go of this sense of self-consciousness or identification with the performance. Again, performing without a performer. Performing without the ego that wants to hijack the performance, and instead just being one with the performance. What does this mean, being one with the performance? This is something you hear a lot when people talk about their flow experience. And this is something you also hear a lot when people talk about what's called non-dual mindfulness meditation. Non-dual means not two, right? Not two. No subject, no object. No inside, no outside, right? No self and world. Everything when experienced from this state of meditation arises in the same awareness that you are. Now, I can use a lot more words, and I will, and I'll talk more about this somewhat esoteric sounding teaching. This is a pre-conceptual teaching, meaning that it's beyond the actual words that could describe it. The example I sometimes give is that if I said red, round, crunchy, and sweet, but you'd never eaten an apple before, you still don't know anything about an apple. So I could say a lot more about this practice, but ultimately it's the experience that's available in this practice that's going to prime you for more flow experiences. So there is research that exists on how mindfulness can increase flow state experiences in sports, music, dance, and academics, and in business. And I won't be covering all of this because I feel like I can just give you the article to read if you're interested, and I'll do just that. There needs to be more research on flow. and we're going to start. I'll actually, Joe and I will be sending out an email to those of you who register, asking if you'd be willing to participate in a research study using the dispositional flow scale. So, so if you're willing, you'll be part of a research project on mFLOW, so we can continue to collect more and more data on how mindfulness impacts flow. But what we do have a pretty good sense of is the neuroscience. So we see that mindfulness decreases activity in the default mode network, which is the experience of self-referential thinking. Right? This is where we think about me and all my problems. This is where the inner critic lives. This is where mind wandering lives. Right? And this starts to slow down in people that meditate. We also know that mindfulness increases prefrontal cortex. This is self-regulation. Interestingly, long-term meditators, 1,000 hours, they actually no longer have to use prefrontal cortex. They're more just naturally and effortlessly present. They don't have to self-regulate. And we find this in the flow experience as well. There was a study done on improv jazz musicians and freestyle rappers where they had to memorize music and then they were put in an MRI. And when they had to memorize it, it required effort. So the prefrontal cortex was lit up, but then trying to effortfully remember their music, and then they'd mess up, and the default mode network starts to criticize them for doing it, right? And it just is a downward spiral. But when they were able to just improvise and just flow, the default mode network went quiet. No mind wandering, no inner narration, but the prefrontal cortex also went quiet. No effort, no self-regulation needed. They could, again, just trust emergence of their talents that had already been conditioned. And of course, there's all kinds of pleasant yet addictive neurochemicals that accompany the flow experience, as well as all of the brain waves that correspond to deep immersive experiences. So in the final minutes, and I'll probably go just a few minutes over because I want to make sure that I get to the nuts and bolts, but I won't go more than 3 minutes over. So thanks for hanging in there. The practice is what really matters. When we get together, it's going to be to support each other and to practice together, but really the growth comes between the sessions. And so this might be an intimidating list of home practices. I don't have any expectation that you're going to do all of these. I have for the last month. I've done all of these almost every day, but I do this for a living, right? And so most of you don't. And the reason I'm giving you this is that different practices trigger flow for different people, right? You'll feel naturally compelled by one of these practices and not the other. And so you get to set up your own daily flow ritual. We'll treat the actual day as a performance event. And in the morning, you'll do your performance ritual, priming yourself for greater flow in whatever you're doing that day. We'll do, we have 5 or 6 different, I think there's 6 different non-dual mindfulness meditations that are different than what you've gotten in MBSR or in MPEAK or other courses. There are 4 what look like Qigong practices that can either be done just in 7 minutes to do all 4, or you can build. You do 4 one week, then 8, then 12, then 16, if this is your jam. There's integrated practices. This is identifying the opportunities like my dog bike ride, identifying these opportunities in your life. Glimpse practices are just short moments where you remember to just open up as awareness, a moment of mindfulness. I will give different prompts on how to make a regular walk a mindfulness and flow-inducing activity. There'll be reading and writing practices, right? There's a way to write where we can actually do it as a meditation itself. So all of you who have told me for years or asked me, hey, when I get a really good idea during meditation, can I stop and take a note? And I've said, no, just keep practicing. Well, now you can. You can meditate and you can allow the stream of consciousness to pour through you on paper. Right? We'll also do reading practices, and we'll do some music-guided meditations and thought experiments, right? And again, you get to just experiment with all of these and choose the amount that works for you. And then we'll talk about what works and what doesn't from week to week. Finally, I wanted to mention that there is the optional field trip. There's a lot of research coming out right now, even out of UCSD, that some of my friends are doing on psychedelics and mindfulness. And a lot of the research is showing very similar brain states as is being shown in deep meditation and in flow. So this is just interesting. This is not a course where we're all going to do mushrooms together. That's the advanced course. I'll leave that for later. But we are going to have an opportunity to do holotropic breathing. It's a way of breathing at a rapid pace. This is becoming more and more popular, that induces a lot of the very same physiological and neurological states as a psychedelic or altered state experience that brings us into flow. And so I've outsourced this with another company who will be coming in on between week 3 and 4. And those of you who can do this, it'll be a beautiful shared experience that we'll have together. So more on that to come. So finally, this is the actual outline. I'd already mentioned the first 3, right? So we'll be setting up the external conditions and the internal conditions for flow. We'll be taking a deeper dive into what is the self and what's beyond the self. I'll give a little hint. The self is not what you think, pun intended. We'll go into relational flow, team flow, and how to bring a sense of flow into group dynamic. And finally, creative flow, right? Being able to open up space so that you can just channel good ideas. And we'll even do an exercise here called mindful mind wandering that will be, I think, pretty interesting for a lot of you. So this is the course. Each time we meet, we'll do an arriving practice. You'll have an opportunity to check in with a partner. We'll do some group coaching around your home practices. We'll do a new meditation together each week for 6 weeks. I'll offer some context and teaching on a topic. We'll do an experiential exercise that's related to each topic. I'll assign the home practices, and then we'll repeat. This is the way we'll spend our time together. But this is the map. The territory can look a lot different. I plan on allowing a lot of room for improvisation, right? I'm not going to stick tight to the schedule because this is a class that's highly participatory, right? The conversation may go in a very different direction, and I really hope to be able to honor that so that we're all organically building the mFLOW experience together. All right. I'll hope to see many of you, if not all of you, next Thursday at 9 o'clock. Thanks again for coming out. Bye for now.